Welcome to Classroom 5.0, a podcast that uncovers industry insights, cutting-edge research, and practical evidence-based strategies that help us all to imagine and design learning environments and pathways for this ever-evolving world, so that together we can best support the next gen to uncover and deliver their unique potential. This episode has been recorded from our hometown of Port Macquarie, which we're grateful to share and enjoy alongside the traditional owners of Beer Pie Country, whose ongoing cultures and connections to lands and waters we celebrate, and whose elders, past, present, and emerging, we pay our respect to. I'm Mariane Power, psychologist and co-founder of the Purposeful Group, and your host again for today's episode of Classroom 5.0. And I'm very excited because, as back by popular demand, we have Zach Mercurio with us joining. If you haven't listened to our previous episodes of Classroom 5.0, you'll find our first episode of literally the first episode of Classroom 5.0 featured Zach. So jump on in, listen to that, but don't do that. Come and listen here first. Let's dive in. I'm going to introduce Zach and all the incredible work he does instead. Zach is an author, researcher, and consultant specializing in purposeful leadership, which is where, of course, he first captured my attention, being a bit of a purpose and meaning geek myself. He also specializes in meaningful work and positive organizational psychology. He wrote The Invisible Leader, Transform Your Life, Work, and Organization with the Power of Authentic Purpose, a book I highly recommend, and works with hundreds of companies, schools, and governments around the world to forge purposeful leaders and cultivate positive cultures that enable more meaning, mattering, motivation. We could all do with some of that these days, well-being and performance. Some of his clients and partners include JP Morgan, Chase, the Government of Canada, Marriott International, American Express Global Business Travel, the Food and Drug Administration, Michelin, the National Park Service, and Hewlett-Packard. That's impressive. His writing on purposeful leadership has been featured internationally in outlets such as Forbes, Inc. magazine, and the Denver Post, and his research has been awarded by the Academy of Management, the Association for Talent Development, and the Association for Human Resource Development. Now, having had the privilege and the pleasure of having interviewed Zach before, I know that's a bit of a humble bio, so Zach, welcome. Everyone can do all their research to find out the incredible human that you are, but I'm just excited to be back in conversation with you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. I was excited to get your email. Well, it started off an email just asking me questions about what's happening in the world.
It did.
And then here we are. So I'm excited to be here.
And then here we are. I went back to that email actually that I sent you in March, and I thought, oh, wow, Mariane, that was definitely an ADHD hyper-focus moment, because I was really into some questions and I loved all of your responses, some of that thinking we're going to get to today. But before we do, I have to ask, I mean, last time we spoke, at least in Australia, we were still in the throes of lockdown. And since then, the world has opened back up. I know that you were really quick to get back out there and meet and greet face to face with the people that you do your best work with. What's that been like? Take us through it.
It's been great and difficult at the same time. One, it's difficult because it's hard to manage a hybrid schedule. I think, I have virtual engagements, but then I also have in-person engagements. But the reward of in-person have been twofold for me. First, getting to wherever I'm going is just an amazing reminder of how cool humanity is, because I get to study work primarily. And I get to interact with those people that are part of our everyday lives, those serendipitous encounters you don't get when you're just sitting in your office at home, like the barista or the airport janitor or the gate agent for your flight or the flight attendant or the person sitting next to you on your flight that's just randomly there, the Lyft driver, the people who are doing the technology for the presentation, right? I think that we're taught a lot to marvel at the natural world, which I think is great. But I always marvel at all of the people that are indispensable to making all of our lives possible through the different jobs that they do. So that's been really amazing for me coming back, and just those serendipitous encounters. And the second is that, it's those in-between spaces where we make meaning. And meaning is made. You don't find meaning. You make meaning with other people. And those in-between conversations after a session, before a session, during a session, those little inputs into that meaning-making process are really magical. So I love seeing that and having that space for that.
Yeah, it's so true with the work point. I'm curious about that meaning making for you. And I know we're going off script here. I do this with you all the time, but for the meaning making when you're presenting,
That's okay.
I think there's an assumption that it's the keynote presenter or the speaker who's all over it. What's that, I guess, that reverse process when somebody contributes back to you, and how does that contribute to the work and your thinking around mattering in particular?
Okay, so just to get into how meaning is made,
yeah, let's do that.
That's important to start, right?
Yes.
The ingredients of how meaning is made. Well, we have all of our life experiences that we've accumulated since we were born and started breathing oxygen. And all of those life experiences are stored in our brain as decision rules. We make decisions about people based on a face we had a negative reaction to when we were 7 years old. It's called person perception in psychology, but our brains take all of that information, and then when we're presented with something new, it's that information that then gets sort of coupled up, like arranged with this new belief or this new insight, right, from my presentation, right? And there's either an alignment, and when someone experiences that alignment, it's important to give people the space to ask, why is that alignment there? What in my whole life has led to this point that allows me to align with this message? But if there's dissonance, if there's space, if there's this new belief that maybe I'm on stage talking about that comes up against this old belief, it's really important to create space for people to navigate that. And one of the best ways to do that is through each other. And so I really, invite people. One of the things I tend to do in some of my talks is invite people to share if they're having a difficult time with a topic or a concept. If this just doesn't seem like it's a truth for you, and why. And when we can unpack that, sometimes in front of everybody together, like I always stop and have that one-on-one conversation, or I can stop and let people unpack that with each other, because usually if there's one person, there's 20, 30, 40 in an audience.
Absolutely.
And that's where that negotiation of these multiple truths colliding is super powerful from a meaning-making perspective. And the output of that meaning-making process is ultimately whether this message is meaningful to you, significant, or meaningless to you. Maybe it's not significant. My goal is always to help people get to the point where they can go through that process and the output is meaningful. But I think it's a good lesson, for me, it's a good lesson to remind myself that these people aren't going to consume a meaning. They're not going to find meaning in my presentation or my teaching. They're going to make meaning. And they're going to likely do that with each other, whether in that room or with their friends when they're driving home.
So within itself, meaning making requires others, is what I'm hearing you say. And I'm also thinking of, I'll pop it in the show notes, Martella and Steger's beautiful framework, which we've used for the Posify Academy around meaning and the components. And so I'm hearing you speak to that coherence piece around what someone's self-narrative is. And
yes.
I love that bilateral process that you're speaking to. It makes me think of, in that email, our correspondence, you were talking about the growth that can come out of trauma, so post-traumatic growth, and the value and the importance of mentors. Can you speak a little bit to that, given that, collectively, I think we can all agree that there's been elements of traumatic events or exposure that we've all really experienced or at least acknowledged. What's the role of a mentor in helping make meaning?
Yeah, post-traumatic growth, for those of you who aren't familiar, is when somebody learns about themselves and becomes better as a result of trauma and or difficulty and or stress. And it was pioneered by psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun and in the 90s, but it's since obviously in the past few years become incredibly popular because if you imagine over time, there's a curve, right? There's two sides of a line. On the top side of a line, it's the light. On the bottom side of the line, it's the dark. Imagine, you're living your normal life in the light, right, on the top side of the line, and then something happens. Inevitably, you face suffering or a struggle or stress. And slowly you can kind of descend into what is actually been called in the literature as an emotional abyss. Why is this happening? How am I going to get through this? What am I going to do to get through this. And it's at that point where you're below the surface that something really amazing can happen. And it can happen when we have a mentor who asks us different questions. Like, instead of how can you get through this? Who needs you to get through this? What are you going to do versus what strengths do you have to move through? Or when have you been in a similar position in the past, and what can you lean on to make it through and move through? And that's where we start cracking open the upward trajectory, right? And we start thinking about things like, there's hope. I have self-belief. I can do it. There's something I can learn. I start to appreciate life more. I start to have relationships. I start to look outward. I start to see new possibilities. I start to realize my strengths and realize that life is meaningful, and I slowly come up to the light. And the power of the mentor is the person at the bottom who helps to reframe, helps to remind you that you are already resilient because you have a 100% survival rate. You already have the resources you need to thrive. And there's learning to be had in difficulty. And the other thing, just as an aside, is all life needs stress to flourish. We would be unidimensional organisms without the stress from our environment, just from an evolutionary perspective. Think about it. If we had no stress from our environments, we'd be little single cell organisms floating around in water. Right?
Yeah,
we wouldn't be these complex beings that we are. These amazing beings that we are.
That's right. The first thing that struck me when you said that, I had the imagery of when we had our bushfires, the really big ones, at least here in Australia back in 2019, and the real and the reasonable panic and fear and horror that came through that experience. And then as time went on, coming to understand and learn that actually some of the new species were brought back to life and given that space to breathe because of the stress and the disaster of the bushfires. And so, that paradoxical experience of, on the one hand, encountering stress and trauma is and personally having lived through a traumatic event myself is awful. I wouldn't wish it upon anybody. And on the other hand, the opportunity for growth. And not everybody, I think we should probably acknowledge, not necessarily everybody reaches that post-traumatic growth experience, but the opportunity for it to be there and the valuable role of mentors is so rich. So thank you for pointing to all of that. It's beautiful. Yeah.
I think it's an important distinction, right? There's a couple. Trauma and suffering aren't good. Right. I'm not saying that these are good things.
Let's all go out and have a traumatic experience. No, they're not.
Right. Yeah. No, they're not good. They're difficult. They're horrific. They're challenging. There is growth opportunities within those challenges.
Hey there, I wanted to tell you about an exciting and innovative solution we've been designing to help solve this problem of how we best prepare the next gen for an ever-evolving world and future workforce that's going to demand a whole new set of skills and mindsets in order for them to thrive. The Posify Academy is Australia's first student-led, evidence-based and curriculum-aligned wellbeing and career development platform, helping young people aged 10 to 14 uncover and deliver their unique potential. It's the first of a trilogy series that's helping young people move seamlessly and with confidence from education and into industry as they design a life and a career of impact. Teaching skills like communication, compassion, creativity, critical thinking, agility, curiosity, resilience, problem solving, all those human capability skills that we talk about here on this podcast, and connecting them with a sense of purpose. To learn more, you can visit theposifygroup.com.au/posify-academy. Now, back to the show.
The other key point I think that's really important to remember is that it's also not about, going out and seeking overwhelming amounts of stress, because too much stress actually is not good. So, for example, there's this theory of constraints, right? Where we have these constraints on ourselves. And as we get into enough constraints, our creativity grows. This is more from a psychological perspective of how stress works to make us better. But it's called the theory of constraints, where when we have enough constraints, it's like a bell curve, our creativity grows with the restraints and the constraints and the stress. But if there's too many, it actually declines. I think we've also gotten to a point where sometimes in the school and with our planet that we're actually putting too much stress on as humans, on the system. So I think it's both. The individual can grow, but we also have a responsibility to eliminate unnatural stressors in the system.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm thinking in particular about,
because if I just said all stress is good and natural and necessary for life, everybody's going to be like, oh, that's fine. I'm just going to go, walk barefoot over hot cold. But yeah, let's go. It doesn't matter what we do, but there is a tipping point, as with everything.
And it's funny you say that, because I'm thinking in particular, as you know, we work particularly, I guess our services and our programs are particularly useful, while good for all, for our neurodivergent, our twice exceptional kids. And I've been doing a lot of reading and trying to understand the impact and the role of the environmental stresses, and how, this season we're having some beautiful conversations with, I would say, heroes in the inclusive education space, who are really helping to advocate and educate for the equity piece of adjusting the environment. And not because, for no other reason, but it helps to build a level playing field where these kids can actually thrive. And so for me, what I'm hearing you say is helping to join those dots between, that stress constraints theory.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to do some more reading. I love that. Oh my gosh. I'm
so glad you mentioned this.
I'm
so glad you mentioned this, because one of the biggest problems that I've been observing with the rise in the resilience training and the well-being training is that it puts all of the onus on the individual to become well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the problem is that a well individual in an unwell system will eventually become an unwell individual. And making sure that we're asking the question, making sure we're asking the question, though, of not only are we equipping individuals with the tools to be well, but is the environment well? Does the environment make well-being possible? And oftentimes that question fosters some real self-reflectiveness and collective self-reflection that we all need. I don't tell people go be resilient, right? But it's learn the resources for resilience. And at the same time, I want to talk to the people who architect the system to make the need for resilience less.
Yeah, that's a brilliant segue.
A lot of our programs are coping programs.
Yes.
Right. I'm teaching people to cope with the stresses a system puts on them versus true, like bi-directional well-being, which is what I think you mentioned earlier. Everything's flowing through.
Yes, that's a great way of describing it. And that's a lovely segue, because I want to ask you about your work with leaders, because, everybody's writing and talking about the Great Resignation, as I know you've contributed to, and or, as I would say, the Great Enlightenment, which I'm sure you can relate to. But there has been a seismic shift in people's expectations of what they want from their lives and what they want at work. What are you noticing is working well in terms of those patterns of belief systems with people shifting, and how the meta leaders or leaders who are working with you are responding in that bilateral way?
Yeah, it's hard in terms of leaders responding, because it's hard to see systems. And it's especially hard to change a system that promoted you. So, for example, when something's benefited you, it's very difficult, I find, for people who are in architectural power to see issues with the system. But there have been glimpses of it. And I think one of the ways that these glimpses have become more and more apparent is through data. I mean, one of my roles as a researcher. And so I think like science is a lens, right, through which we can understand humanity and the world. And I think that it's also a lens that can open doors, because you can put something on the wall, you can put some data on a screen, and you can say, what do you think about this? And that's been really powerful to see people. And what is the data saying? When the first pattern, and I may have mentioned this when I was on before, but I'll keep on just saying this over and over and over again, is that the last 2.5 years has revealed a demand for dignity. Dignity is the inherent worth of a human being, that someone is worthy of respect because they're a human, period. This is difficult, right, to understand. Dignity is not brought on by merit, what you do or what you don't do, what you produce or what you don't produce, if you perform or if you don't perform, if you meet your quarterly goals or you don't, if you meet your test score goals or you don't, if you're an educator. Dignity is your worth, period. And I think people are no longer willing or tolerating being means to someone else's end and being judged in that way. And so dignity also means the second trend is being treated as a full person, a human, like a human that has to drop kids off at school or go to a therapist appointment, or a human that gets sick or gets stressed. And I think that people are understanding that there's like work and life or school and life. There's actually no boundary, right? A human is alive wherever they're living and breathing. Their needs are the same wherever they are. And so I think that that is a key pattern that people are sort of demanding, that their full person is accepted. And the way some leaders are when they see the data, right? That, you know, toxic culture, for example, in work predicts whether someone's going to leave 10 times more than pay or flexibility from, you know, MIT researcher Charles Sull. Or they see a study by McKinsey and Company that finds that the number one reason that's in almost every person's reason of why they leave without another job in tow is because of uncaring leaders, right? Over samples of thousands of people. Or when you look at research in schools and you find social isolation, family stress, feelings of instability, lack of meaningful connections and relationships, too much unsupervised time on the internet, causing isolation, right? All of those things are going back to what? Dignity of the person, treating people as full people, and making sure people have the space to create relationships and to know there are worthy ends in themselves, that they're a worthy end in themselves. And I think people are starting to get it. I think people are starting to realize that there is a skill set associated with leadership that makes it necessary to ensure that everybody feels valued and knows how they add value, and that it's not just common sense based on the data.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, pre-pandemic, there was probably a crew of us who were still having to bang on with our messaging and do a lot of educating and, hey, come over to the side where work doesn't have to just be work. Whereas,
all I do is bang on with my messaging.
Well, Zach, you bang on in a very good way about your messaging. It's still important, but I feel like it's landing in a different place than maybe it was.
Because these patterns, I know, yeah. These patterns, it's funny when you say like patterns, or when I read this, because I was like, it sounds a little bit like trends, or patterns, but it's
different. Same and different.
Patterns is, but a pattern is, these have been the patterns since humans were humans, that people demand dignity. You know, it's just been covered over by our production merit-based system.
I couldn't agree more.
But it's cracking through now. People have had the time to reflect, and it's cracking through. And I think it's good, ultimately.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on that and share, if it's helpful or sparks a conversation about, for me, the difference between pattern seeking and spotting, which again, I think our neurodivergent community do really well just inherently, and then trends. So for me, the difference is in the authenticity and the connection. So pattern spotting is what is intuitively, intrinsically, authentically happening at a collective level, and going, I noticed that was connected to that. It's taking that systems thinking lens. Trends, I tend to see as, and this is non-scientific, by the way, this is just a Masonism, but I tend to see trends as more manipulating the patterns that we have in a way that has commercial potential, or that's helpful for
that is brilliant.
A goal. Is it? Awesome. Can we write a book on that?
Yep. Brilliant.
You can be the author, Zach. I'm very happy to hand
Cut that out. No. That is brilliant. I'm not going to even say anything. It was brilliant. And I think it's an important distinction between the difference between a pattern and a trend.
Yeah. And I think we're undervaluing the people in our population who are natural pattern spotters, because it's almost like that futurology, right? And that's where I want to get to with you, because we're going to go a little bit woo-woo. Back in that email in March, I went, woof, hang on a second. What got me into the meaning and purpose literature was a lot of the spiritual aspects that come with the purpose element. And I'm going to throw it over to you, let you speak. But I was really curious as I started to dance and share some of what I know is in the psychology literature and the scientific literature around spirituality, the idea of spirituality being an important component of meaning and purpose. That's not being spoken about, at least not here in Australia. Can you talk us through if and why that is important. And if it is, given we know the benefits of purpose, particularly in our kids, how can we provide spiritual opportunities for our kids in particular to grow?
I think that meaning and purpose cannot fully exist apart from spirituality. And the reason why is because purpose, for example, is knowing how to me, and in my work with purpose, is knowing how your uniqueness makes a unique impact on those around you. Meaning and meaningfulness, I'd make a distinction. Meaning is our sense of what's happening. Meaningfulness is the outcome of what's happening as positive and significant. And so meaningfulness, again, is not possible without being able to connect that experience you're having to something that's significant to you, right? And what I mean by that is those connections, you can't see them. You can't touch them. You can't feel them. You can't objectively measure them. Even the best scales in the world from psychology can't. And what spirituality is, it's the recognition or belief that there's something more than what I can sense. And so, for example, if a student is learning about their purpose, when they, and learning about the interconnections of everything, and when they're learning about a gift that they have, or they're learning about an assignment they're working on, or learning about something they're working on and thinking about their impact on someone else or something else, which is purpose. When they're doing that task, you're not seeing the impact right there as you're doing it. You're not seeing the upstream impact. You have to imagine the inevitable impact that you have to experience purpose. It's unseen. It's a spiritual endeavor. Because you cannot sense it.
I hadn't thought of it that way.
Right?
You almost
So,
have to future forecast yourself into the point of your impact having created itself in order to sustain the motivation to move that direction. Is that kind of what you mean?
In order to believe that you have something to contribute, you have to have evidence in your environment that you have something worthy to contribute. And that evidence is you don't get Facebook notifications when you completely change the trajectory of a human being's life, yet we do it every day.
But nice if you did.
So you have to have upstream thinking, right? You have to imagine a future impact that your strengths are going to have, or this task that you're working on is going to have. Even when you think about purpose within a lifespan perspective, if you're working on something right now, right, and you're thinking it fulfills something down the line, you can't see the future. You have to have a faith that what you're doing now is going to produce that possible future. That's spirituality. The other notion of purpose is the crux of why purpose works. And Dr. Corey Keyes writes this beautifully, that there are 4 types of purpose. There's just aimless but useless purpose, which is you don't have a goal and it's not useful to other people. There's a purpose that has an aim, that like make a lot of money for myself, but it's not useful for other people. And then there's purpose that has an aim, you have a goal, and it's useful to other people. And research finds that it's that last one, purpose that has a goal and is useful, that actually has the neuroscientific benefits, neurological benefits, and physical benefits, and learning benefits that purpose has. And what does that mean? Well, our usefulness to others, it means that the object of our behavior is outside of ourselves. It's another person. So there's an invisible connection between me and something outside of myself that makes purpose work. It pulls us forward. And it's those invisible connections. Once you start believing in the invisible connections between yourself and the world, you're spiritual.
I like that. Speaking of patterns, I like that. And can we get practical for a moment? I'm thinking in particular of our parents or our educators who are really new to this space.
We're going to have to descend way below the clouds.
Yeah. That's true. Okay, let's not do that. I'm going to say go back to episode 1 of Classroom 5.0.
No, let's do it. Let's do it. No, let's get practical.
Let's get practical.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you said let's get practical. And I was just thinking of the last thing I said. I'm like, we got to go.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's do it.
That's true. Let's descend to the ground from the clouds. I like playing in the clouds, by the way. But what can we do as parents? And you and I are cheating because I have this inherent sense that we probably do it anyway. But what can we do as parents in a day-to-day, everyday experience, especially because if we think about spirituality and people's then connotations with religion around that, and a lot of our church environments, community groups, and I think COVID contributed to this, they've all shifted and reshaped again. And at least here in Australia, we're moving towards ethics, yes, but less around these big existential questions. So what role can they play in promoting purpose and promoting spirituality in the young people's lives?
One of my favorite exercises, and I did it, I actually got to go speak with an elementary school, is I went to this elementary school, my kid's first grade class, about purpose. You can imagine this. And they get it. Let me tell you, they get
totally get it.
And one of the things that I said to them is I said, what are some of the jobs that you have to do in this classroom? Like, what's some of the work you have to do? And there was there's this little girl in the back, and she raised her hand and she goes, "Oh, well, Miss So-and-so, the teacher, we have to be quiet." That's the job, is to be quiet.
That's a big job.
I said, okay,
for an elementary kid.
Yeah, that's quietly. A big job, right? And I said, well, tell me, why do you have to be quiet? And she started saying, well, it's because we have to be quiet because so-and-so tells us to. And I go, well, what do you think would happen to another person in your class if you were not quiet? And all of a sudden, there was a light bulb, right? The connection, the spark. And she said, well, I guess they wouldn't be able to concentrate. And she's like, what's that word? Concentrate. And on what? And they're like, on our reading. And I said, so one thing you can do is every time before you have to be quiet, instead of just being quiet, bring that person next to you to your mind, your friend who you really like, and say, oh, I'm going to help them concentrate and read today. And by doing that, I'm going to help them be quiet. And she was, they just got it, right? So one of the things that you can help people do is help kids see their inevitable impact or the why of what they're doing. And it seems very trivial, but help them really see and experience it for themselves. Ask them questions that ask, well, why would we do that? What would happen if we didn't do this? And then when you help kids to understand that and start using that muscle of upstream thinking, of connecting to a time and a place and a person that's not them, a whole world explodes, because that's the foundation for empathy, foundation for compassion. I mean, spirituality is the foundation for those things because it relies on these unseen connections. So that's one thing you might do. And it's starting to ask better questions and helping people see beyond the time and space and task that they're working on.
Oh, I can't help myself. It's a landscape that I'm so deeply in. I'm thinking of our autistic community and the parents listening right now who'll be like, I don't know, that's going to work for us, Zach. My kid takes things really literally. And what I want to say to that is that first and foremost, I think there's a misconception that an autistic person lacks empathy, because we know they do. It's a theory of mind delayed development as opposed to an empathy problem. And I'm also really curious, and it's okay if you haven't, because I haven't found anyone who has, how can we reshape that thinking and scaffold it a little bit more for kids who might need that more literal demonstration and who can't necessarily join the dots to see the patterns on their impact towards others? They can see the impact for themselves, but how can we help scaffold that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I got to teach a pretty large class for second-year university students on leading with purpose, and there were at least 3 students who self-identified as
that's a big jump from elementary to
more
uni.
on the Asperger's.
Yeah,
right.
interesting.
Yeah. But it's a powerful exercise that I was able to use, and one of them was a map. I had them draw a map. I had them actually pick something that they had done that day, and then I had them draw the potential impact of that thing on someone else. And it could be anything. It could be like holding a door. It helped someone smile, or it helped them get to a class. And I had them just draw 5 pattern points, right? So 5 major dot points. And I called it my impact map. And so what they could do is they could see it, right? They could start seeing it. And it was really small. And some people wrote things like, I held the door for somebody. They got to their class. And then I have them imagine what could happen to that person because they got to their class. right? They got a good grade. They went on to, and some students go wild with it. And they're like, they went on to be a doctor, or they went on to do this, or,
I love that.
and they have these big maps, and I have some saved. I have a lot saved. But what's really powerful is then you have them either pair up or get in groups, and you ask them to fill in the gaps for each other. So someone may be able to say in a small group, oh, and have you thought about what could happen if they, you open the door for them and they smiled and they were happier when they went and talked to their friend, or can you imagine what could happen for them this way? And all of a sudden you get multiple perspectives on meaning making. You get the objective map of seeing it, your impact, and then you have something to talk about. So that's another way. If people like drawing, or if people have like to see things and visualize things, have them actually like draw out the impact that something makes. And it can be a good project also for kids who like to express themselves through art, or through drawing. Like, have them draw the impact they want to make on people, and just leave it at that. It's powerful.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that experience. It, as you were talking, it made me think psychologists or coaches who are listening, or parents in the autistic community, of social scripts. And we know that social scripts are helpful, not necessarily that we want to fix the social interpretation, but that they can help to scaffold someone's experience and understanding the other person's perspective. But I also I think I heard you pick up on that idea of peer-to-peer conversation, or informational interviewing, in a way of if a young person can't identify what that impact might have been, actually sitting with somebody else and riffing on it and brainstorming and saying, okay, well, what impact might have had for you, and helping them to see those multiple experiences. Yeah, there's so much of what you've shared I'm going to really think on. So thanks for sharing all of that. Speaking of next gen, and speaking of coming from the clouds down to practical, we've been running with this hypothesis lately, because there's a lot of conversation with the changing world of work and, people's changing belief systems, that we've got to get the next gen at the table to have a voice. And I love that you do that in person, by the way. But given that you're moving into organizations and working with leaders, we're kind of interested to hear how companies and organizations are positioning themselves to their talent, if you like, of tomorrow, speaking the HR talk, and helping them to see this changing world of work. Because, when we go into schools and we say, hey, guess what? The workplace has changed, and you don't necessarily just have to go for a single job. Now you can think about the impact you want to create and what it is that you stand for. Sometimes we're met by parent committees that go, really? Are you setting these kids up for failure here, Maz? Like, what's going on? So what work are you seeing in organizations to help communicate that shifting change back to the next gen and that bilateral relationship, if at all? Because, we haven't seen it yet. So I'm curious to hear from you. I'm
going to tell you what I'm seeing, which is not much, and then why I think I'm not seeing much.
Oh, okay.
Right? So I'm not seeing much.
Woo, mic drop. You're not seeing much. And I think
what happens is that, like, I'm not seeing much. And I think that what happens is that it goes back to your trends conversation. I think generational research and the labeling of generations is a really nice trend, that people have trendized, or trend. We should make a word for that when someone turns something into a trend.
That could be a Zachanism. You can have that one.
Yeah. We could, thank you. We could trendize it, right? And so when something's trendized, it gets treated like a trend. It gets treated like a flash in the pan. So what's happening, and I see this happen all the time, is people say, let's think about what the next generation needs. What will keep them here? What will get them here? What will help them be successful? And it's a very them-oriented approach, right? So it's basically, let's have people who are not in the generation think about what this other generation needs, and then apply and prescribe something to them, right? So it's a lot of leading to and not a lot of leading with. And one of the things that I think needs to happen is that instead of telling Gen Z what you've created for them, help them co-create it with you.
Yes.
And I think there is a huge need to help the upcoming generation co-construct what work and what organizations can be and should be. And I think that we need a lot more, especially in that space of leading with instead of leading for or leading to, which can happen. And so I haven't seen much, but I'm really hopeful. that you're pursuing your thesis, your hypothesis that it's missing, because it is, in my experience. And I think if we can give people the opportunity to co-construct the future instead of prescribing the future to people, I think that's a key shift we need to make.
It goes without saying, I couldn't agree more. I'm curious, though, how can we maybe lean in on some of the trends that are happening? Because there's always, you know, my dad always taught us, you've got to come to the other person's side of the table, sport. You know, I can hear his voice in my head. And, you know, we've created this culture of, well, us first. You know, at the end of the day, organizations, yes, of course they want to create impact, hopefully, if they're good organizations, and they've got the bottom line to contend with. And as to your point, they are systems that have grown over time. Change is difficult. So in my thinking, it makes sense that we'd be talking diversity, equity, inclusion, bringing people together. But if I had to say, Zach, what's the case for togetherness? Nothing about us without us type of philosophy. What's the mutual benefit from an organization's perspective?
I like that.
Right? Of playing in this space, in co-design and co-creation.
Yeah, I mean, if an organization cares about their bottom line or a result or a retention statistic or profit, there is not one single metric that an organization cares about that is not mediated through human beings. And so, human beings mediate any metric that anybody cares about. And the problem, what we've gotten into with an obsession with short-term thinking, is that we've lost the distinction between leading and lagging indicators. I talk about this a lot because I think it's one of the missed opportunities for leaders. Profit, retention, performance, on an individual or organizational perspective, are lagging indicators. They are lagging indicators. The leading indicators of all of those things are individual and community well-being. Again, an unwell individual is not going to perform. A person who doesn't feel like they matter to a community is not going to believe that anything you say or do matters. A person that doesn't feel cared for is not going to care. Right. So the way I bring this up is I have people, and I have these conversations all the time because I work with executives of large organizations on the importance of mattering, right? They're just trying to get their quarterly earnings reports up. And one of the things I always say is name one metric that's not mediated through a human being. And what would you want those human beings? What's the optimal state they should be in to mediate these important things? And they all say the things we want: belonging, togetherness, having a voice, purpose, meaning, motivation. And so it's, okay, how do we bridge the gap between we know this is important and the practice of how to make it happen? And that's, I think, where you can start bridging the gap. I think human well-being, togetherness, all the things that you said are leading indicators for everything else everybody cares about.
And I have to say, you know, again, statistically, they're suggesting 27% of the workforce by 2025 is going to be made up of Gen Zs. That's kind of a big population number to listen to and to co-create with. So if there's this conversation around meaning and mattering and why it all matters, want to join that conversation, because these Gen Z kids are all over it, and they're not just wanting it, they're demanding it. Which is, you know, from my experience, what a brilliant case study on mass collectively. Right. Gosh, Zach.
And it needs to it does need to start in K through 12, right? I mean, you know, there's a dissonance that's happening if we talk about meaning making. Largely, a lot of the research has been indicating that this is the purpose generation, in the sense of there is more of a drive to do something meaningful. Because think about it, if you've been grown up with this interconnectivity of all of the problems you're able to see in the palm of your hand, it activates something within people of like, what am I going to do? Or on the flip side, there can be an apathy towards it. everything's already screwed up, I'm going to self-protect. Either way, that connection to each other and to something bigger is critical.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because I've been curious. I mean, we know developmentally that purpose develops in adolescence. There's this peak period of spirituality, sort of up until mid to late 20s, where if you're going to get the purpose bug, you're going to get it then. And yet we talk about this particular generation being so purpose driven. And I've been curious around, so thank you for pointing to it, that moderating or mediating factor of the interconnectivity of exponential technology. And that, yes, maybe purpose, it can peak in that period, but maybe it's peaking en masse, because to your point, these kids have got exposure at a particular developmental point for them as humans in their human experience, where they can see that this stuff matters. And because of all the interconnectivity, they actually can make a difference, and a real difference, and see that difference and get that feedback. So I just think it's really exciting in terms of the evolution of where we're going, and all the wicked problems we need to solve. I think if we're going to back anybody, it's going to be the Gen Zers and the kids that follow.
And the Gen Z are also prioritizing well-being more than ever.
They sure are.
Individual well-being, community well-being. So I think leaders have to, make sure that if you are an organization, that you have a purpose worth committing to. I think the second thing is that meaningful work is going to be imperative. Making sure people can use their strengths in their work to make a difference. They know that they matter. And then I think that, we have to take well-being seriously. And those things, and then bringing the people affected by those things into that conversation of how we do those things. I think that's the opportunity.
I couldn't agree more. And Zach, I can't let you go without asking about what you're working on next. Speaking on thesis, I know that you've shared some research, just niggles and giggles, and you got us all guessing. But tell us a little bit about, what are you hoping to uncover? What are you finding, if anything? And it's okay if you can't share yet. But yeah, what's the research all about?
Yeah, I am embarking on a study where I'm interviewing 50 people on mattering across the lifespan. So we're interviewing people about what creates the experience of feeling valued and knowing how they add value. And we're getting down to a moment to moment perspective.
Wow.
Asking people questions like, what is the first moment in your life when you felt like you mattered as a human being, and what was happening around you, having people recall those things.
Wow.
We're uncovering what are the commonalities of people's experience of mattering in work and in school. And what we're hoping to do is to build these things into a theory of mattering, that what creates mattering for human beings, that hopefully communities and organizations and society can use, and education can use as a framework, as a starting point to ensure that people are equipped with the practices that align with whatever we're going to find to create mattering.
So you're suggesting mattering is almost like a whole new construct. Again, because it makes sense. I just assumed that there would be all these studies about how to measure it, how to, but there's studies on how to measure. There's studies on how to measure mattering. There's studies thematically about where it comes from. But like most things, there's not a lot of studies on what the experience of mattering is actually like. Yeah.
And how it's different than, and how it's a little bit different than belonging. For belonging is being welcomed and included in a group. Mattering is the feeling of feeling like you're valued and you add valued in that group. Right. So what we're reading and researching is that it seems that mattering has to come first before everything else. Like, again, if you don't feel like you're worthy of belonging to a group, it's very hard to belong to a group and feel like you belong. If you don't feel worthy, it's very hard to use your strengths and use your voice if you don't first believe you have a voice, a meaningful voice. Right. And there's been talk even in the scientific circles that, mattering is the animating force of life itself. for example, the belief that we matter, it would be hard to get out of bed if we didn't have that little spark within us that says, what I'm going to do today, even if it's just the laundry, matters because my life matters. And when we lose that, it can be devastating. And I think you're seeing that with social isolation. We're seeing that with deaths of despair. We're seeing that with drug use. And it all goes back. Everything goes back to isolation, right? You read all these articles, social isolation. But there is one step beyond, I think. And that step beyond is that we've lost the spark, the belief, the animating force of life, the predisposition we would need to go into any day. And that's the belief that I and my life matters. And so we're exploring this idea that mattering comes first.
I love that. And for me, it's such a beautiful step back down the ladder from the meaning and purpose to getting to the basics. And it's just the possibilities in there of learning from people's lived experiences and how we can then pick up on that. I can't wait to see your findings, which throws me to
and the purpose stuff, right? It's like,
it will matter.
And as you said, with
tangible.
the purpose work, like if we tell somebody to go find their purpose or their contribution, but they don't yet believe they have something to contribute. It's like telling someone, go run 3 miles without running shoes.
Yeah. Or go run 3 miles before you figured out how to crawl.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's really stepping it right back. Oh, Zach. Yeah. I'm
or if we tell
so
someone
grateful.
like, oh, we need you to use your strengths, take a strengths assessment, but they don't believe that they have strengths first. Very difficult, right? So mattering is cultivating that prerequisite belief for life itself.
So much so, I think that you and I are going to have to chat off camera and figure out how we put in mattering modules into the Purposeful Academy, especially since we're saying it's the foundational toolkit. Now I know we've got this whole missing piece. Oh, Zach, thank you so much. How can
I'd love to talk.
Up? Let's do that. How can everybody follow up with you and follow the research you're doing, the incredible work that you put out into the world? Of course, I know how to hyperstalk you on the internet, but please share with everybody else. Where can they find you?
Yeah, you can check out my website. I have one of those. It's zachmercurio.com. But I am actually active on LinkedIn, and I like it. And I have a nice group of people who tend to resonate with what I'm thinking. And I post things that are useful to me of understanding the world that I hope will be useful to others. And then I figure out if they are useful to others. So people tell me. So jump on LinkedIn if you're on there and connect with me there at Zach Mercurio. And I'd love to have you part of this community that we're building.
Oh, thank you, Zach. I want to also give a plug for your Instagram page because it's a little pop of purpose positivity that I think we could all do with right now. So we're going to throw those links into today's episode show notes. Zach Mercurio, as always, it is such a pleasure and a privilege to speak with you every time. My eyes light up, my brain goes off, and I just find the good stuff. So thank you for sharing it with everybody. You've been listening to another episode of Classroom 5.0. It's so good to be back. And until next time, we will see you later, alligators.
Classroom 5.0 is brought to you by the Purposeful Group, a socially conscious education company arming the next gen with a sense of purpose and the future skills they'll need to thrive in this ever-evolving world. Your ratings and reviews really mean the world to us, so if you loved this episode, please let us know and share it with a friend. We'd like to say thanks to our editing guru, Clint Brands, and his team at My Video Producer, who helped us put this show together and who have kindly sponsored Season 3 of Classroom 5.0. And for today's show notes, links, and more episodes just like these, you can visit thepurposefulgroup.com.au/podcast. Thanks for helping us imagine alive the future of learning, work, and leadership. We'll see you next time.